Welcome back to Red Hat Redemption. Breaking news. This is where I need one of those panicky CNN breaking news banners that they use like every 10 minutes. Anyways, this is an update on a story from part 3, but I didn't have time to squeeze it into that video, so here we are. Turns out the downside to making videos about an administration this crazy in advance is that a lot of things will happen before you're done editing. Anyways, remember this guy? That's Juan Orlando Hernandez, the guy who was facing a 45-year sentence for trying to import 400 tons of cocaine into the US before Trump pardoned him out of nowhere. At the time, there wasn't an immediate explanation, and while I still think the theory that Thiel and Andreessen's special economic zone may have played a part, turns out the reality is actually much worse. This former president, along with Trump, Argentinian President Javier Milei, best known for jumping around with a chainsaw on stage with Elon Musk and having cloned his dog 6 times after consulting with a medium and coming to believe he met this dog in a previous life as a gladiator and a lion. Yes, really. And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have all been conspiring together to not only get Hernandez back in power, but also create a propaganda outlet with the purpose of disseminating misinformation with the intention of destabilizing multiple left-leaning governments across Latin America. Deep breath. I mentioned the stuff with Milei and his clone dogs in past lives and mediums to acknowledge that yes, this all sounds insane, but it's also confirmed via audio leaks fully analyzed by a forensic company employed by over 60 nations. Just a quick reminder that there are no ideas too unhinged when you're dealing with extremists and radicals this obsessed with power and control. We're on to part 4, and in this section we'll be covering the more moderate concerns of assimilation and cultural identity, and a more extreme version of it known as the Great Replacement Theory. While the former is understandable on the surface, I do believe it has been exploited in favor of the latter, which has explicitly racist origins. To begin, for those who may not be familiar with the Great Replacement Theory, I'll begin with a brief description. It starts with the French author Renaud Camus, and it's based on trends such as the percentage of Americans who identify as white only declining from 72 to 62%, and record numbers of immigration in Europe from Muslim nations. And to be clear, these trends are factual, albeit often exaggerated with terms like invasion. Where the theory becomes deeply problematic is when it changes from demographic trends, which are caused by a wide variety of factors, such as environmental and colonial ones. Just take a quick look at the number of nations the United States and UK have meddled in over the centuries, for example, to one more conspiratorial and sinister, which of course involves, you guessed it, a cabal of elite Jews. Essentially, the theory is that there is a sinister and deliberate attempt to replace white populations in America and Europe with people of color. In Europe, this usually entails a fear of Muslim immigrants, and in the States, it is generally applied to Latino immigrants, although non-Muslim Africans and Asians are certainly not exempt from the theory either. The first noteworthy example of this theory hitting the States occurred during the Charlottesville Unite the Right March, where white nationalists marched with tiki torches chanting, "Jews will not replace us." Some may also remember Donald Trump referring to this march as an event in which there were, quote, "very fine people on both sides." And despite his consistent denials of this henceforth, we have that clip on video.
It's on both sides, sir. You said there was hatred, there was violence on both sides.
Well, I do think there's blame. Yes, I think there's blame on both sides. You look at both sides. I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it, and you don't have any doubt about it either. And if you reported it accurately, you would say.
Kill the person. Heather hired
Charlottesville. They showed up in Charlottesville
Excuse me.
to protest.
Excuse me. They didn't put themselves down as you, and you had some very bad people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
This was an event in which a woman was murdered by a driver who plowed their car into a crowd of progressive protesters. Now, one common piece of the theory is the idea that Jewish global elites are pulling the strings and making this so-called replacement happen. While many more noteworthy thinkers will place Jewish with globalist, the two terms have often been interchangeable throughout the decades. This theory has also been cited by multiple mass shooters, such as the man behind the Tree of Life synagogue shooting, the Christchurch shooter in New Zealand, and the Buffalo mass shooting, among others. But the theory hasn't only been cited by fringe extremists that no one's ever heard of, which is why I decided it was covering. It's also been alluded to countless times by Tucker Carlson, perhaps the single most popular right wing commentator of the last decade, and someone who I'll note has also been flirting heavily with anti Semitism as of late. The white nationalist website VDare, which Stephen Miller has previously contributed to, praised Tucker Carlson for bringing the theory into the mainstream. Carlson has also on countless occasions suggested that, quote, Democratic politicians want them to stay here because, you know the answer, each one of these people, no matter how revolting, is a potential vote for them. The reality, however, is again the polar opposite. The Heritage Foundation, which is a right wing think tank that is probably slightly to the right of Mussolini, put together a database of proven instances of election fraud. To reiterate, this is the Heritage Foundation. They want this to be a trend. And yet, if you look at the actual website, you'll notice there are shockingly few of these. Only 77 illegals are on this website's entire list. And while the map was first published in 2017, the data goes back well over 20 years. So if you do the math, an illegal immigrant vote has slipped through the cracks roughly 1/13 millionth of the time. That is the equivalent of picking one single person from the entire state of Pennsylvania. This crisis is quite simply completely fabricated. And that's not even touching on the fact that roughly 60% of those who did vote illegally on that Heritage Foundation website happen to be Republicans, which might be why there's also not a drop down search feature by party. And it doesn't stop with just mouthpieces. Representative Scott Perry, a vocal Trump supporter and a participant in attempts to overthrow the 2020 election results, has said, quote, replacement theory is real. They added white to it to stop everybody from talking about it. Blake Masters, an extremist who received a $15 million donation from far-right billionaire Peter Thiel, who also, by the way, donated $15 million to J.D. Vance's Senate run, narrowly lost the Arizona Senate run in 2022. He cited a white supremacist as an influence on his brand of conservatism, named the Unabomber as a subversive thinker people should know more about, and cited the Great Replacement theory when accusing Democrats of trying to flood the nation with millions of immigrants to change the demographics of the country. And finally, we have the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, who has echoed this theory that has encouraged mass shootings. In 2022, he claimed that Democrats, quote, want to replace voters that are already here with immigrants during an interview with, yeah, guessed it, Tucker Carlson. In a statement that's even more clear in its implications, he also said, quote, you can't have so many people coming to the country at a time when our own families aren't replicating themselves. That is not a statement about doing it the right way or about crime. It's about a population battle. And Stephen Miller, when attempting to apply the actions of one Afghani immigrant, who, by the way, worked with our military before coming here, said, quote, this is the great lie of mass migration. You are not just importing individuals, you're importing societies. No magic transformation occurs when failed states cross borders. At scale, migrants and their descendants recreate the conditions and terrors of their broken homelands. This is, at its core, an evil and racist lie. It suggests that humans created in the image of God are irreversibly condemned to replicate the worst aspects of the societies from which they come from. The aforementioned statistics on immigrants committing crimes at a lower rate already disprove this on their own, but before moving on to the final section of the series, I want to remind people of a very small sampling of immigrants, many of whom are from third world nations, or failed states as Stephen Miller would describe them, who have made incredible contributions to our society. We've got Nikola Tesla, who helped pioneer AC electrical systems and helped make modern power grids possible. Andrew Carnegie built Carnegie Steel, which became the foundation of our industrial expansion. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. Ellen Ochoa, the first Latina woman in space who also directed NASA's Johnson Space Center. Eric Yuan, who founded Zoom, which basically saved us all from losing our minds during COVID. We've got Tope Awatona, the CEO of Calendly, which also was another vital app for when we all went remote overnight. And oh yeah, some guy named Albert Einstein. And when it comes to assimilation, an important question to ask is who is driving the concern on a lack of it, and on what specific grounds would they make that case? Because while I think we can all agree that there is no need to bring in people who flat out hate America, There's also a wide gulf between justified critiques and outright hatred. But when the standard for assimilation looks more like upholding white supremacist ideals and American exceptionalism, which is a belief that America is inherently superior and unique and therefore immune to historical criticism, then the request suddenly becomes quite unreasonable. To quote an article from Newstrail, assimilation implies absorption. It suggests that those who arrive in a new country must abandon their language, customs, and traditions to blend seamlessly into the mainstream. But culture and language go beyond the external. They carry with them internal factors like memory, humor, identity. Enforcing the abandonment of these principles can lead to the development of what psychologists call double consciousness, which describes the dual self perception experienced by subordinated or colonized groups in a racialized society. Additionally, the children of parents who experience forced assimilation were less likely to perform well academically. To close this section, I'll provide a quick personal example. I have a couple of immigrant neighbors who are fairly different, but both have been great neighbors. One speaks very little English, but has a Christian symbol in their front yard, has always been kind and respectful to me, once even helped mow my lawn without me needing to ask for help when my mower was breaking down. The other has a Buddha statue, and sometimes they play their cultural music loud enough to hear outside, never during work or sleep hours. But they also speak perfect English. They help feed the stray cat that I keep safe, and their son happens to date a white girl. So, which of these two has assimilated more, and by whose metric? At the end of the day, the concept itself is very subjective with no clearly defined set of expectations. And if both are great neighbors, why does it matter? Or we can take this very recent case of a pastor named Yeson Cortez Vasquez being detained and even initially denied access to a Bible by ICE the week before Easter Sunday, until they reversed course once public outcry hit the media, of course. Is there a more clear example of assimilation into a nation that our current administration continues to claim is allegedly Christian than that of an immigrant who came here following our laws? In this case, via asylum claim, leading a congregation. And yet, that wasn't enough to prevent his detention or subsequent religious persecution from the same regime that claims to oppose such a thing. If the unwritten rules of assimilation can be altered or withdrawn at any moment that the political winds happen to change, then assimilation is simply not a reasonable requirement to demand of immigrants. And in fact, it isn't even a requirement that this very administration made recently for one very specific change to the National Defense Authorization Act, a change signed by Trump late last year, which is automatic draft registration. While it needs to be noted that this is not the draft itself, the updated registration process requires it of not just green card holders, but refugees, asylum seekers, and undocumented men. The exact same people being hunted down, often violently arrested, as we'll see in part 5, and deported, are apparently American enough to potentially fight and die for this nation, but not American enough to be allowed to continue the process we put in place for them in the first place. So, to close out the section, I would argue that a welcoming nation who embraces its new immigrant neighbors is also one that those new neighbors will want to be a part of, while still maintaining their cultural heritage. And as Christians who believe that one day members of every tribe and tongue will gather and worship together, diversity is in fact a good and healthy thing because all of humanity is made in the image of God. And every single one of us has something they can potentially share with the world and the nation they live in. So that is it for part 4. Unfortunately, part 5 is going to end up divided into at least a couple videos, maybe more. It is just far too long and there's far too much damage that I do not want to ignore that this administration has done. I'll probably release them all at once, but take your time on these ones. It's going to be a lot to take in. So, keep an eye on your mental health. Take your time. There's no rush. But part 5 will be coming next week.